Welcome, everyone, to the Swinburne webinar series on aging. If this is the first time you've joined us, we have these presentations every 2 weeks or so. My name is Sunil Bar, and together with Mark Silva, we will be your hosts this afternoon. This webinar is being presented through Microsoft Teams Town Hall platform, which may be new to some of you. The format for this afternoon is very simple. Our presenter will speak for about an hour, which will give you some time for questions. If you have questions or comments at any point during or just after the presentation, please use the Q&A function to send us your questions. At the end of this presentation, or towards the end, I'll send you a link to a feedback survey, and it'll be very helpful if you are willing to provide us with feedback so that we can improve this experience for all of us. We will be recording today's presentation, and in a few minutes, I'll send you the link to our webpage where you can access these recordings. So I'm going to share my screen and introduce the webinar this afternoon, as well as our presenter. So the title of today's webinar is Neuropsychological Aspects of Dementia. And before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which Swinburne campuses are based, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. This webinar focuses on the neuropsychological symptoms of dementia. We're very lucky to have with us Dr. Luke Smith, who will explore the changes that can occur in cognition, social cognition, and behavior as a result of developing a neurodegenerative disease such as dementia. Luke will identify the non-pharmacological strategies and therapies that we can use to manage these symptoms. Luke Smith is a qualified clinical neuropsychologist who consults privately across Victoria and Tasmania. He's also employed as a mindfulness tutor at Monash University and has a passion for education and skills training, as you will see shortly. Previous to gaining qualification as a neuropsychologist, Dr. Smith worked as a behaviour management consultant and counsellor for Dementia Australia in Victoria and South Australia. He has a research and clinical interest in dementia as well as more broadly neurodegenerative diseases. Luke, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm going to bring you on screen and welcome to the webinar.
Thank you so much, Sunil. It's always a pleasure to come and present and also to catch up with you and Mark. Hi, everyone. I'm also calling in from Wurundjeri country. And before sharing my screen with you, because I'm going to use some PowerPoint slides just to provide some structure to the talk today, I thought I might just introduce myself and what I do. So I'm a clinical neuropsychologist. And for those people who have never met a clinical neuropsychologist before, I'm a psychologist that specialises in brain functioning. So you may know of other psychologists, particularly those that provide psychological support to people who might be experiencing mental health concerns. Neuropsychologists are a little bit different in that we usually provide assessments, recommendations and support around things like cognitive functioning, which is a term you're going to hear today that we're going to go through. My work in the dementia space has now been close to 15 years, both as a counsellor and as a neuropsychologist. And I want to just acknowledge that if anyone in the audience today attending does have a neurodegenerative disease or a form of dementia, that firstly, hi, and also just to let you know that the way that I'm talking about dementia today can feel maybe a little bit cold and clinical. I just want to acknowledge that these conditions are affecting people's lives. They are a lived experience for people. And even though I'm going to break down symptoms and talk a bit about it, I just want to acknowledge that if there's anyone in the audience who has that lived experience, that I respect that, and I do apologise if I come across as a little cold. Also, if you are someone in the audience who supports someone who lives with a form of dementia, just to acknowledge you being here as well, and that I'm going to talk today about generalities. I'm going to talk about sort of general things to do with dementia, but it's important to acknowledge that firstly, everybody living with dementia is an individual and experiences this journey differently, but also it's the same for their supporters, their families, their friends, their neighbours. So I just wanted to put that in the room. before we start. And I'm also now going to share my screen so that we can get going. Okay. So just a bit of an outline for the talk this evening. First, I'm going to talk about what dementia is in a more broad definition, just so that we're all on the same page. Then I'm going to talk about the cognitive symptoms. Now, this word cognitive or cognition is really just a fancy term for thinking and memory skills. Most of you have probably learned by now that health professionals just like to use fancy words to make themselves look smarter, but that's all it means. It's your mental processing. We're going to talk about behaviour changes. Sometimes for some forms of dementia, it can affect our behaviour and change us in different ways. We're also going to talk about social cognition, which is an area I find particularly fascinating. These are the automatic ways that our brains socialise. I'm going to talk about the mental health symptoms that people with dementia can develop. And then toward the end of the talk, I'm going to focus on what we call behaviour support. There's different terms that we use, such as positive behaviour support sometimes is used. But how do we support people living with dementia if they do have changes in their behaviour and their cognition? And I'm going to provide a general outline of what behaviour support is and some takeaway strategies that you might be able to use. But I do need to let you know that what I'm going to touch on during this talk is very much the tip of the iceberg when it comes to behaviour support. But hopefully, if it is something you find interesting, you will find opportunities to develop this type of skill set. So what is dementia? It is a really important thing to consider because it is a term that has many connotations and often is quite loaded within our society. Often when people, for example, hear the term dementia, it often causes them some concern and sometimes some fear. Now, I'm talking about in a very general statement here about what dementia is. But this term dementia covers a range of different illnesses or diseases that affect the brain. So when we use the term dementia, we are talking about illnesses and diseases that affect the brain, but particularly ones that get worse over time. So that term that Sunil and both I have used, this word neurodegenerative diseases or neurodegenerative conditions, neuro meaning brain, degenerative meaning getting worse over time. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about dementia. To be diagnosed with a form of dementia is a neurodegenerative disease that is going to get worse over time. When we use the term dementia, it's when these changes, these symptoms that occur because of these brain diseases get to a stage where they're significantly impacting or restricting someone's lifestyle. In other words, their ability to be able to be independent, to be able to do most things for themselves. So we start to use this term dementia when a neurodegenerative condition has worsened over time, when someone's thinking and memory has declined, when their behaviour has changed. And this is when we start to use the term dementia. That's the word that we use. In the early stages of some of these conditions, sometimes we use the term mild cognitive impairment. What that term usually refers to is when someone might have some very mild and isolated changes in their thinking and memory. And even though they might be frustrating, they're not necessarily restricting someone's lifestyle, restricting their ability to be able to be independent and do things for themselves. So I thought it might be helpful if we all start on the same page. There are many different types of diseases, brain diseases that cause dementia, and I'm only going to touch on a few of them today because I'm providing more of a broad outline. So to give you an idea about what's happening, I am lucky in that as a neuropsychologist, I often get access to a lot of medical information. And unfortunately, for the majority of neurodegenerative diseases that cause dementia, there is not one test that can diagnose them. So often we rely on something called a consensus diagnosis. Unfortunately, what that means is for most people, they will have to see a series of health professionals over a longer period of time to have a diagnosis confirmed. But what's happening inside our brains when we have a neurodegenerative condition is that we are seeing an atrophy of the brain. What that means is, unfortunately, over time, the brain is shrinking. So you can see from this picture here, this is actually from a study of people with Huntington's disease by Tabrizi et al. What you see here is a series of 3 MRI brain scans that have been put together. If you're looking at the screen like me, there is a brain on the left, a brain in the middle, and a brain on the right, and this is all the same person being mapped over time with a series of MRI brain scans. What you'll notice is that the heads are all facing left, and over time, if you look at this picture, you will notice that there is a change in the colors that you see. So on the left-hand side of the brain, you can see we have this brain that has lots of white and gray color. This is brain tissue that you can see. And then if you follow this same brain, the same person, from the left to the middle to the right, you'll notice in this picture that there is more black space. This black space is where we're seeing cerebral spinal fluid, which is the fluid we have in our brain. But what it's showing, unfortunately, is that there is less brain tissue. So this is when we talk about progressive neurological diseases, this is what we see. Why I'm providing this slide today is hopefully not to confront you too much, not that object. But when I do talks, when I do workshops about dementia, I often talk about this concept of a glass skull. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we don't have glass skulls. So when people have brain conditions, often we find it difficult to interpret and understand the changes that they are experiencing. If someone has 2 broken legs, for example, and is in a wheelchair, we are not going to ask them to run. And yet, because we can't see people's brains, we often assume things, we make judgments, sometimes unfairly, for people who live with dementia, live with these conditions, simply because we can't see their brain. And also, we, as a species, as humans, we are visually dominant. What that means is that we rely on our vision, in terms of our senses, more than any other sense. And again, if we can't see it, and we have to think a lot about it, sometimes we find it difficult to understand. So I guess what I'm providing you today through this study is a glass skull. This is what happens in the brain for someone when they have a progressive neurological disease causing dementia. So as a neuropsychologist, I provide assessments for people. The assessments look at a number of different cognitive abilities. So just a reminder that the word cognitive functioning or cognitive abilities simply means thinking and memory type skills. So I wanted to share with you what I measure and how this can change with a progressive neurological disease causing dementia. The first thing you'll see up on the slide is information processing speed. Again, this is just a fancy word for thinking speed, how quickly people can process things. Some forms of dementia, particularly early in the condition, they cause a slowing of thinking speed. So for example, vascular dementia, which you may have heard of before, where people have lots of large and small strokes in their brain over time, often they have a slowing of their thinking speed. Parkinson's disease dementia, Parkinson's dementia, is also another form of a progressive neurological disease where you see this early change in thinking speed. Now, I don't know about you, but when I reflect on our modern lifestyles, maybe it's just my own bias, but I think that we are becoming much more fast-paced in the way that we live. And unfortunately, if you have a slowing of your thinking speed, the world becomes even faster because you're having trouble keeping up. The way that this sort of reflects in everyday life is that people have difficulty keeping up with the speed of conversations. They may have difficulty quickly working through different tasks. For some younger people, because we also know that dementia can affect younger people, what we call younger onset dementia, people under the age of 65, or even older people, if you're still working, a slowing of your thinking speed means you're just not as efficient at work. The next line that you can see there is called attention and concentration. We measure attentional abilities regularly when it comes to neuropsychology, and I wanted to talk about a few different domains or a few different skills in this area. The first is what we call attention span. Attention span is how much information you can take in at one time. So the average adult attention span around the world, regardless of your gender or ethnicity, is 7 bits of information plus or minus 2 bits of information. So most adults around the world can take in 5 to 9 bits of information at one time, such as when in conversation with another person. For people living with dementia, this attention span often shortens over time, and they may only be able to take in 2 or 3 bits of information at one time. So in other words, they get overwhelmed when there is larger amounts of information, and they may not take in as much as they used to. Another part of attention is what we call sustained attention, or what you might think of as concentration. For some people living with these conditions, they are not able to sustain their attention for a long period of time. They might become easily distracted, their attention might fluctuate, and I see this a lot because unfortunately most neuropsychology assessments take approximately 3 hours. So someone's sitting in front of me at a table doing thinking and memory tests, and I'm directly observing the fluctuations that are happening in their attention and concentration. The last area of attention I wanted to talk about is multitasking. Now, the brain can't actually do two things at once. What it does, and it's very clever, is it very quickly switches concentration and attention back and forth between things. A skill in everyday life that we know relies heavily on our ability to switch our attention or divide our attention is driving. So when you're driving, you might be looking at the road, then you switch your attention to your blind spot, then you switch your attention back to the road again, then you switch your attention to the radio. We're constantly moving our attention around when we drive. And we know from research that this ability relies heavily on people's ability to multitask or switch their attention. The next one is called working memory. Working memory is our ability to hold things in our head and manipulate that information or work with that information. A really common example of working memory is mental arithmetic. So when your working memory changes, people find it more difficult to hold things in their head. I once worked with a person who had Alzheimer's disease, and they had this change in their working memory. They were actually a chef, a cook. And what they were finding most frustrating is that when they were trying to cook recipes, they were having difficulty holding all the information from the recipe in their head and using it and adjusting that information. And they found that the quality of the meal they were making was just not as good as it used to be. Now, for those of us maybe who aren't keen cooks, that wouldn't be a big difference, but this person was a really quite well-known chef, and also they used to show love to other people through cooking. So this was quite a large change for them. Visuospatial processing is an area we don't often talk about, but something that is really important to consider when someone is living with a form of dementia. As I mentioned before, humans are visually dominant animals. Again, what that means is that we use our vision more than any other senses. But without our brain, our eyes are actually completely blind. Our brain is the organ in the body that takes in all that raw data through our eyes and organizes it, integrates it, remembers it, understands it, makes sense of it. So in day-to-day life, visuospatial processing is things like being able to judge the distance as you sit down on a chair, being able to judge the fall and step of the stairs that might be in your home. Or if you're like me, every morning I have to back my car out between the fence post and the letterbox. And to do that, I am using visuospatial processing. You may have friends who are artists, builders, architects. A lot of their work is based on this use of visual information. But for conditions including Lewy bodies disease, Alzheimer's disease, they often affect this aspect of visuospatial processing quite early in the condition. The next area that often we look at as a neuropsychologist is language. We don't cover this in as much detail as our speech pathology and speech therapist colleagues, which often form part of a larger team when they're diagnosing or supporting someone with these conditions. But language includes things like simply being able to communicate, what we call expressive language. So for example, with language, people might have what we call word finding difficulties, which is where you go looking for a word and you can't find it easily or you can't find it at all. Just to reassure you that word finding difficulties actually increase as we age. So it's a normal part of aging that we have difficulty finding words. It's also normal that if you're pretty stressed or you're very tired, you also have more trouble finding words. So when I measure, for example, someone's ability to be able to find words, I'm looking at whether this difficulty is beyond that expected for their age or stress, or if they're having any difficulties with sleep. So that's one form of language when people are trying to find the words, use the words and put them together. And as my speech pathology colleagues would probably say, I'm not doing a great job of breaking all this down, but I don't have time today. The other type of language is also what we call receptive language or comprehension. So forms of dementia don't just affect our ability to talk and speak and communicate with words. It can also affect our ability to comprehend what other people are saying to us. Partly because you could imagine that if you are if your thinking speed has slowed down, if your attention span is shorter and you can't take in as much, or even your working memory is not doing what it should, you simply just don't take in as much information. Learning and memory, you'll notice that on this part of the slide, I've used the word learning as well as memory. Because even though most people living with forms of dementia will say or experience a memory problem, it's not as straightforward as that. So for the purposes of the talk today, if you will indulge me, I'd like to break down memory into 3 stages. The first is learning, which is where we're taking in information through our senses or thinking about information, and we're learning it. Hopefully, if you're not too tired on a Friday evening, that's what you're doing with me right now. You're learning through hearing what I'm saying and observing what you see on your computer screen. Then once we've learned information, it goes through a whole lot of different cognitive processes. We then store it. So we store it quite diffusely within our brain. Diffusely meaning our memories are stored in lots of different parts of our brain, but they are processed through a part of our brain which is called the hippocampus. Then once we've stored those memories, we then need to retrieve them. This is the act of remembering. So as a neuropsychologist, I actually measure remembering, trying to pull out that information from our memory store in a number of different ways. One is called free recall memory. This is where you have to try and remember information off the top of your head without any prompts. An example of this might be, when is your next doctor's appointment? Recognition memory is when you start to use prompts to see if that information is still stored within the brain. So it might be, is your doctor's appointment on Thursday, Friday, or Saturday? And when you experience that light bulb where you go, oh, it's Thursday, that's what we call recognition memory. So memory is more than just remembering. Memory is a series of processes that I look at as a neuropsychologist to try and determine what sort of conditions someone might have, but also what we can do about it. So learning and memory encompasses many different things, but for many forms of dementia, people can experience memory difficulties. But I do need to let you know, which I'll talk about a little bit later, the memory difficulty we associate with Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately, is particularly significant. An area I wanted to spend a bit more time focusing on is called executive functioning. Why I wanted to do this today is that as a neuropsychologist, this is often the area that I get most questions about. Executive functioning is the more complicated and complex parts of our thinking. It's often what we call in neuroscience top-down processing. So it includes things like insight. One thing that a lot of people with dementia at some point are accused of is being in denial. The fact that they have a condition, the fact that there are issues. But what I want to really help to do today, hopefully, is break down that myth a little bit. So reduced insight or difficulties with insight is a neurological symptom. And I'm going to try and explain to you why this happens for people living with dementia through asking you to solve a riddle today. Ironically, I'm going to get you to use your executive functioning to try and solve a riddle. So here's the riddle. If you break your leg, what part of your body tells you that you're in pain? What part of your body tells you that there's something wrong? Now, the hint might be in the neuropsychology title today, but it is your brain. Your brain is the part of your body that allows you to understand that you've broken your leg and that there is something wrong. So when you go to the doctor and the doctor says, look, unfortunately, you have broken your leg. You need to wear this moon boot for 6 to 8 weeks. Please don't drive, and you need to go and see a physio. What part of your body allows you to understand and remember that information and then relate it back to your broken leg? Hopefully you're coming with me here, but it is, again, your brain. So here's the riddle. What part of your body tells you there's something wrong with your brain? And that's the issue for some people who live with dementia. Diseases that cause dementia are neurological, meaning that they are brain diseases. And for some people, their brain loses the capacity to be able to let them understand and remember what is happening in their life. Some people might even say to you, look, I have Alzheimer's disease, or I've been diagnosed with vascular dementia, or whatever condition they have, but then they may not be fully aware of what their symptoms are, why they might need support, why the people in their family might be feeling a bit stressed. They might say something like, you all have the problem, I don't have the problem. And this is usually not a form of denial. Usually it is a lack of insight caused by the condition that they are living with. So people can be in denial, but it's very rare in dementia. So denial is where I'm aware of something, but I'm denying it. So it might be someone says, Luke, you have a drinking problem. And I say, no, I don't, even though I know I do, which I don't think I do. But there's a difference with a lack of insight. A lack of insight is where you're not even aware of often what's happening for you. So hopefully if that's an experience that you've had as someone living with dementia, or if you're someone supporting someone with dementia, that might explain why you're not always on the same page. The next one is idea generation. This is your ability to come up with ideas quickly. So often for people, when you ask them a question, particularly an open question, when they live with dementia, and an open question is something like, what do you want for lunch? What do you want to wear today? They have to come up with ideas. They have to generate ideas, which can be challenging for some people living with dementia. Self-monitoring is our ability to be aware of what we're doing as we do it. My occupational therapy colleagues who I work with will often monitor this, particularly if they do a home visit for someone living with dementia, to see how safe they are in the kitchen. Are they aware that they have left the stove on? Are they aware that they are carrying around a hot saucepan? Are they aware of what they're doing as they're doing it? The next area is reasoning and problem solving, which hopefully is relatively straightforward. It's our ability to make decisions, use reasoning, use logic. If we experience any problems, being able to solve them, come up with solutions, consider the outcomes. This is also considered an executive functioning. Planning and organizing involves being able to plan and organize our day, plan and organize our routine. I have many memories of when speaking with people who live with dementia, where their families first noticed the symptoms when they visited this person around Christmas time, and that person who had been amazing at organizing family Christmas parties every year started having difficulty planning and organizing the Christmas party. Maybe it is they forgot to invite some guests. Maybe they didn't buy the right number of ingredients. Maybe they forgot to turn the stove on. Maybe they had difficulty organizing the desserts. The last one is what we call inhibiting automatic responses. This also relates a little bit to the types of behavior change they're about to touch on. But within our skull, if we all had a glass skull and we could see each other's brains, maybe we could see the fact that so much of what our brain does is automatic. What I mean by that is that so many things happen in our brain outside of our awareness without us even thinking about it. There's a part of our brain called the frontal lobe where we almost have this filter that allows us to very quickly, very, very quickly make decisions about what we're going to say and what we're going to do. For some people living with dementia, they have trouble inhibiting automatic responses. What I mean by that is that this filter that really quickly looks at what we're going to say, what we're going to do, it doesn't work quite as well as it used to. So hopefully, I know I'm covering a lot of ground today and it is a Friday evening, but hopefully I'm giving you some insights into what I look at, or when we talk about cognitive functioning, or a bit more an idea about what this glass skull might be, giving you insights into how the brain works, and therefore how people's thinking and memory skills can change when they develop dementia. A friendly reminder that not only do different forms of dementia affect people differently, but even if you had 100 people in a room living with Alzheimer's disease, they would all be experiencing the condition slightly differently. So I am definitely here talking about general symptoms, general changes that people can experience, not any particular one person. Okay. This next area we're going to talk about is behaviour change, and it's going to be a bit more of a focus later on the talk when we talk about behaviour support strategies. When behaviour changes, we look at different ways that it can change. But I need to really emphasise today is we are talking about behaviour and personality change. We all have lumps and bumps with our behaviour and personality. So for example, I am someone who I'd like to consider as a relatively calm, gentle person. But if you see me at the MCG on a Saturday afternoon watching the Melbourne Demons, then you might get a different impression. We are talking about changes in behaviour and personality from before the person developed a condition that causes dementia. When it does change, we look out for different types of change. Apathy is a really important change, and as a general rule, apathy increases as dementia progresses. Apathy is where people have a reduction in their motivation, in their interest in things, in their get up and go. We particularly notice apathy when someone is faced with a new or different situation or a change in their routine. Often people will start saying no to things that previously they really enjoyed doing, or the no seems illogical to the people around them. Disinhibition and impulsivity is this change in the filter, when people might start to say or do things without seeming to consider the consequences. I don't care who you are, we all think things that might be inappropriate. Socially, in social situations or in our relationships, when people become disinhibited or impulsive, that filter stops working. So some examples might be someone suddenly buys a $10,000 television because they saw it in a store or online, even though they have a perfectly good television, and in fact their family says that previously they were pretty frugal with their spending. It might be that someone starts to say things in conversation that are pretty rude. I remember talking with a gentleman who cared for his wife who had a form of dementia, who said when we came out of lockdowns, like everybody else, a lot of our friends put on a bit of weight. I think we used to call them COVID kilos, didn't we? And my wife just started telling everybody how much fatter they had got, which was really shocking and embarrassing because previously she was someone who had amazing manners and a great way with people. So it can be this impulsivity in what we say or what we do. Rigidity and inflexibility is where people have difficulty being flexible with their behaviour. Changes in their routine, maybe going on holiday to somewhere different, maybe not going to that same restaurant every time. And this can be particularly frustrating for the people who support them because it means their life becomes very predictable. There's not much spontaneity. And if there has to be a change, like maybe a family member needs to go into hospital and someone might need to go into respite for a period of time, this rigidity and inflexibility makes it very difficult to adjust to new situations. The next one I want to touch on is irritability, agitation, and aggression. But I want to make it really clear is that not everybody, in fact, most people with some form of dementia don't become aggressive. It's a bit of a myth, unfortunately, and an unfair stereotype that people with dementia will eventually become aggressive. It's simply not true. But unfortunately for some people they might because of the changes happening in their brain. Irritability is where people just seem to be a bit grumpier. Agitation is where they start to say or show through their body that they're angry or frustrated. And aggression is the highest end of this. Aggression can be physical in that people might punch or kick or bite. But also aggression can be physically taken out on objects. For example, if I picked up my phone and threw it against the wall in anger, that would still be physical aggression. It's just not towards someone, it's towards an object. And aggression can also be verbal. So this can be screaming, yelling, swearing, threats, etc. When we experience this type of behavior change as a supporter or whether the person themselves is experiencing it, it can be particularly distressing. We know this from research, but I just need to reinforce that it doesn't happen for everybody who lives with dementia. The next type of behavior change is called stereotyped and repetitive. This is where people tend to say or do the same thing over and over and over again. Sleep-wake reversion is where people might start waking at nighttime, being awake at nighttime more and sleeping more during the day. When someone is in a supportive situation or a caring situation, this can be particularly challenging because it is hard to be supportive when you have a lack of sleep. And the last one, which you'll see there, is called hyper-orality. Hyper meaning lots, orality meaning eating or around the mouth. So for some people living with dementia, they may start to eat a lot more food, particularly sweet foods or fatty foods. And this can be concerning when someone starts to put on weight. They might start to, if for example, they have pre-existing diabetes, this might start to be a complication. So behavior can change in a number of different ways, as you can see from this slide, and hopefully what I'm saying is making sense. But when behavior changes, and this is what we're going to talk about later, when you break down all the symptoms of a progressive neurological disease, the vast majority of research says that it is actually changes in behavior and personality that cause us the most distress as professional people, as family members, as neighbours, as friends, to the people around the person living with dementia, but also for the person with dementia themselves, more so than memory changes, walking changes, continence changes, functional changes. It's changes in behavior and personality that cause the most distress and stress when we talk about dementia. which is why later I want to focus on some strategies maybe that you can consider. So social cognition is a growing area of research and more recent that looks at the ways in which our brain functions when it socializes. We are group animals. What I mean by that is that we live together. Our survival is basically based on living around other humans. Over time, our brain has evolved to allow us to more easily socialize with each other. And what I'm going to talk about next is some of these automatic processes and automatic cognitive abilities that happen within the brain that can change when someone has dementia. So the first one is that research shows that for some people living with dementia, they will have more difficulty interpreting the emotions that you show on your face. The face is often considered the gateway to our emotions when people are talking with us, when they're interacting with us. We show so much emotion on our face. But for someone living with dementia, they might have trouble interpreting the emotions on other people's faces, and in particular, negative emotions. Sadness, disgust, anger, fear. Often someone will have difficulty interpreting these emotions or get them mixed up. Interestingly, a lot of research shows that the emotion that they have less difficulty interpreting is happiness, which I find fascinating. So in other words, people with dementia might have more difficulty interpreting the negative emotions on your face, but not the positive ones. But social cognition is more than that. What we automatically do, what our brains automatically do, is we don't just read the emotions on people's faces, we then try to read their minds, again, almost automatically. So for example, if I see someone that has an angry face, I don't just leave it at that. I then think, why are they angry? I try and guess at why they're angry. Why this skill is particularly important is that if I can determine why you're angry and I don't want you to be angry, I then change my behavior. I then change what I'm saying or doing. So for people living with dementia, they sometimes get accused of being cold, uncaring. My favorite two that I really hate is attention-seeking or manipulative. One of the reasons why people with dementia are unfairly labeled in this way is because of this breakdown in social cognition. They may have more trouble reading you, which makes them appear colder or more uncaring. They may have more trouble reading your thoughts and what you're thinking, which means they might be accused of being attention-seeking or manipulative. But these changes are brain-related changes. They're not doing these things on purpose. It is the condition that are causing these changes. The next part of social cognition is actually reading or understanding the emotional tone of voice. So I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but whenever I go to the supermarket and I say to the person at the checkout, how's your day going? Often I'll say, good, thanks, in a very low, flat voice. And what that tells me, or automatically what my brain tells me, is that they're actually not having a good day, they're actually having a bad day. So part of this skill, this social cognition, is also reading the emotional tone of people's voices. But it also goes the other way, strangely enough. Some conditions, some neurological conditions that cause dementia do affect the way people express emotions. So for example, there is something called, pseudobulbar affect or emotional lability. This is where someone shows an exaggerated emotion, whether it's excessive laughing or excessive crying, but the emotion they're feeling inside is actually not that exaggerated, it's not that severe. A really great example of this, which comes to mind, is that someone's partner, female partner, was telling me that their partner, during movies that were slightly sad, started crying uncontrollably. And the family were really concerned they might be depressed. But this is where their brain was just not regulating their emotion as well, because they were, at the end of a romantic comedy, we all get a little teary, but rather than just being a little bit teary, they were excessively teary. For people who have types of dementia which we call movement disorders, so movement disorders includes things like Parkinson's disease, some forms of motor neuron disease. Some of these conditions can cause dementia, not necessarily for everybody, but for some people. And what happens for those conditions is that it actually changes the way that the muscles show on people's faces. So for example, you may have heard of this term Parkinson's mask or Parkinsonian mask. So people may actually not show as much emotion on their faces because the muscles are not moving to show those emotions like they used to. The next area is what we call mental health symptoms. And I'm so sorry if I'm going too quickly today for you, but I'm making sure that I get through these slides so I have some time for questions at the end. Hopefully, if you miss anything during this talk, you can just go back and rewatch it in your own time. So these mental health symptoms are sometimes what are called psychiatric symptoms. I prefer mental health symptoms myself. Here's things like emotional ability, which is what we spoke about before. For people living with dementia, their risk of depression and anxiety does increase for most forms of dementia. This can be because it is incredibly challenging living with a condition that causes dementia, but also because the thing that regulates our emotions and our mental health is actually our brain. So sometimes for people living with a disease causing dementia, they will experience anxiety and depression because there is an imbalance now happening in the chemicals within their brain. Things like dopamine, serotonin, the balance of these chemicals and regulation of them can change. Also, it's important to note that there is some overlap between depression and anxiety. For example, sometimes I have mildly shocked doctors or family members or people living with dementia when I have said, look, I don't think the person is depressed. I think that they have apathy, which is that behaviour change we spoke about before. It's important to note that even though people with dementia will express their mental health differently maybe to people who don't have dementia, depression really does rely on you being sad. Some people living with dementia actually might be quite happily apathetic. They may not be motivated, they may not be interested, but they don't appear to be sad. So it's important that we really consider this, whether someone is depressed or apathy or both. The next one is delusions and hallucinations. When I'm talking about these symptoms, by the way, and if you are living with a condition causing dementia, please know that I am not painting a picture of your future. I am not gazing into a crystal ball and thinking that all these things are going to happen to you. But if I don't point them out, then people just don't know what they are. So delusions is where we have a false belief, a false idea that is not based in reality. When this does occur for people living with dementia, usually these delusions are quite scary. They might believe that someone is out to hurt them, someone has stolen their wallet or a possession that they might own. Some people may believe that their partner or family member is cheating on them. Hallucinations is where our senses plays tricks on us, and in fact it's our brain that is playing tricks on us, because it's when we see or hear or taste or touch something that again isn't based in reality. For most people living with the condition causing dementia, usually these hallucinations are visual in that they might see someone. So for example, for the condition dementia with Lewy bodies, it's a lot of people will experience visual hallucinations where they might see people or insects or animals, particularly at nighttime. So we call these nocturnal hallucinations. Sometimes hallucinations can also be auditory, so they might hear music or hear someone speaking to them when in fact that isn't the case. That word confabulations is often something we don't speak about, but this particularly applies for Alzheimer's disease. This is where we remember something that maybe never happened. So what happens is we know is that when that memory part of your brain, what we call the hippocampus, is not working as well, sometimes your brain will make up memories. And again, this can be really concerning for all people involved. So what I want to do in a really basic way is show you how this information that we collect about thinking and memory, so about cognition, about behaviour, about social cognition, how we then use this information as neuropsychologists to help diagnose a condition causing dementia. Again, it's really important to note that when we diagnose dementia or a condition causing dementia, there is generally not one test that will diagnose that for us. Often people will see a series of health professionals, and the information from all those health professionals will form what we call a consensus diagnosis. Now, a neuropsychologist most of the time does not diagnose dementia by themselves. They do it as part of a larger team. And this is just a general way of showing you how I might use this information when I'm considering what a condition a person might have. So we talked about memory before, and that term naming is when we're trying to find those words, those word finding difficulties, again, which naturally increase when we age. For some people living with dementia, these word finding difficulties are much more severe than just what happens with age. So this memory might be rapid forgetting, where someone is asking that same question 5 times within the space of a minute, remembering things that happened an hour or two ago, or forgetting familiar people. So these memory and naming things come from the part of the brain around the hippocampus or the temporal lobe or the posterior parts of the brain, posterior meaning towards the back of the brain. For someone who has difficulties with reasoning and logic, changes in behaviour, such as we explored before, or changes in social cognition, which we can measure with tests, we're often looking at a condition that is starting more towards the front part of the brain or the frontal lobe, or sometimes what's called the frontotemporal areas. So in a very basic and general way, we can use the information that we get from neuropsychological assessments to start telling us where this disease or condition might be starting and therefore what type of condition it might be. So for example, again, coming back to this idea of the brain, when we're looking at these changes in memory and naming, we're really talking about the hippocampus and the temporal lobe. Whereas these other things we're talking about is frontal lobe, different parts of the brain. So for example, if I was working as part of a cognitive dementia memory service like we have in Victoria, I might start saying to the geriatrician or the specialist doctor and the other people in my team, I'm concerned that this person that has really significant and severe forgetting and naming problems might have Alzheimer's disease. Or if someone is showing these changes in behaviour, changes in social cognition, changes in executive functioning, I might start to consider they have behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia. So please just be mindful that this is a very basic way of demonstrating how we use this information. Diagnosis is absolutely more complex than this, and we use diagnostic criteria, but it hopefully gives you an idea about how I use this information diagnostically. Behaviour support, I believe, is a really important aspect of how we support people living with dementia, because, as I mentioned before, when there's changes in people's behaviour and personality as a result of an illness or disease causing dementia, it often has the largest impact above other symptoms that someone might be experiencing. We can support behaviour in a few different ways. One of them is pharmacological, meaning medication. Now that absolutely has its place, but because I'm not a medical doctor, I don't prescribe medication. I don't have that expertise. The type of behaviour support that I have expertise in is what we call non-pharmacological or non-medication behaviour support. It is a skill set that people can learn when you're supporting someone who lives with dementia. It does take a bit of effort and training, and as I mentioned at the start of talk today, this is very much the tip of the iceberg when we talk about behaviour support. So behaviour of concern, which is what you can see here on the slide, is any change in behavioural personality for someone living with dementia that causes them or other people distress. Why it's important to consider this term, and behaviours of concern is just one term. There are other types of terms used to describe these behaviours. This is just the one that I use. It's important to sort of consider whether the behaviour is just slightly different or strange, or whether it's a behaviour of concern. I will give you an example of this. I was once consulting for an elderly woman in an aged care facility who was having delusions. So just a reminder, this is where we believe or think something that isn't based in reality. These delusions were that every time a helicopter or a plane went over the roof, over the sky above the aged care facility, she believed that this was God sending her an angel. There were a lot of planes and helicopters because, strangely enough, the aged care facility was actually near an airstrip. I got called in by her care team, who were a lovely bunch of people who were really concerned about this behaviour and wanting my expertise about how they can manage it. And I think I spent about half an hour with them rather than half a day, because this really was the only behaviour that the staff were concerned about. And I said to them, is this really a behaviour of concern? Does she find it concerning? To which they said no. And once I explained that this was a delusion, they didn't find it concerning either. So it is really important to differentiate between a behaviour that might seem slightly unusual versus a behaviour of concern. Behaviours of concern, when you look at the research for people living with dementia and progressive neurological diseases, is directly related to things like safety risks for the person living with the condition, for the people that support them. It is directly related to things like stress for professionals. So for example, if you're a professional carer, a health professional, someone working in the dementia or aged care field, it is directly related to levels of stress, burnout, staff turnover. Now I use the word carer burden here, and I know that not everybody likes this term, so I do apologise, but this is the term that's primarily used within the research. Carer burden is a level of stress, both physical, emotional, financial, that is placed on people supporting someone living with dementia, particularly as that condition progresses, because we are talking about progressive brain conditions here. Financial burden is something we don't often talk about, but behaviours of concern definitely affect someone's financial security, including their ability to be able to live at home, whether that's financially viable. And then also, importantly, it's associated with lower well-being for people who live with dementia. So I know that I'm probably hammering it home a bit here, but we really do need to consider when someone has a disease or a condition causing dementia, if and how it might be affecting their behaviour, if there are behaviours of concern in that situation, and then what we can do about it, because research tells us this often has a massive impact for people living with dementia and for the people that support them. The general concepts that you can consider when we talk about behaviour support is it's an adjunct to medication. What that means is that you can use non-pharmacological or non-medication behaviour support strategies when someone is also on medication. I need to make it really clear when we talk about behaviour support, we are talking about managing and supporting someone's behaviour, not fixing their behaviour. If, and I'm being a bit flippant here, but if you use behaviour support strategies and the people's behaviours of concern disappear completely, contact me, we'll go and get rich. Because either you've been able to do something that no one in the history of time's really been able to do, or you have cured a disease that does not have a cure. If you go into a situation using the strategies, some of which we'll explore today, thinking you're going to completely solve the situation, completely fix the behaviour, you're not doing behaviour support. Behaviour support is about managing and supporting someone's behaviour, supporting their well-being and safety by reducing the frequency and intensity of a behaviour of concern. Frequency meaning how often that behaviour of concern is happening and the intensity at which it happens. It does require consistency in a team approach. It is a bit of a trial and error process. We are talking about creative problem solving here that's based on knowledge and skill set, but it does take that type of intuition sometimes. And the strategies that we use when we're using behaviour support strategies need to be targeted and regularly reviewed because someone's behaviour probably is going to continue changing over time. Unfortunately, these illnesses, these diseases, they progressively worsen, they progressively change over time. So we do need to keep up with that. So I once looked at all the research around different models when we talk about how do we do behaviour support. There's lots of different models out there, different programs, different processes, but when you really break it down, what we're doing when we're doing behaviour support looks like this. The first thing we're doing is we're identifying behaviours of concern, which is what we've just spoken about then. So what is this behaviour? Is it causing anyone distress or concern? You could even think about it as, is this maybe apathy? Is this maybe impulsivity? Could this be irritability? You can start to think about it in that way. And then what we do is we try to collect data to identify the triggers or causes for this behaviour. By triggers, I mean an antecedent or something happening around the time that the behaviour occurs. So for example, if I have an argument with someone who is living with dementia and that causes them to become angry, the trigger for their anger is me because I am arguing with them. These triggers, these causes, there are a wide range of them, and we don't really have time today to go through a lot of them, but there's different things that you can look out for, things like who's interacting with the person and how are they interacting with them. What sort of environments is the person in when they're experiencing these behaviours of concern? What time of day will these behaviours of concern be happening? Once we collect that data, which sometimes we do through observing, sometimes we talk with people who know the person well, sometimes we even do behaviour charting, which is where we collect data on a chart. We then look at implementing strategies. But I need to make it really clear that behaviour support strategies that are based on really knowing the triggers are much more effective than just generally trying strategies. Then, once we've done that, we look to review our plan. Did the strategies work? Were the triggers the ones we thought they were? Are there any other behaviours of concern that we might need to look at? This is just a general way that we think about behaviour support, but you may also notice this is just a general way that we solve problems. There are two different types of strategies that we can use with behaviours of concern. There are proactive strategies, which are strategies we put in place to try and reduce the risk of a behaviour of concern happening. But the ones we're going to look at today, because I would argue this is where we live most of the time, is reactive strategies. The person with dementia because of their condition has shown a behaviour of concern, and we're thinking, well, what do I do now? I have been teaching behaviour support and helping people understand dementia for probably now close to 13 or 14 years. And when someone is showing a behaviour of concern, whether it's at home with their family, whether it's with friends, whether it's in an aged care situation, it causes a lot of stress. And I used to go into talks and seminars and workshops with people like nurses and aged care attendants and shove research down their throat, trying to convince them that behaviour support would be useful. But because often they were so stressed, it didn't really convince them. And one day I sort of happened upon an idea, and this is the idea that story sometimes can really help us learn, even more so than research evidence. And now this is an Aesop fable. It's called The Wind and the Sun. I'm not sure if you're aware of Aesop fables, but they're very, very famous stories. I'm going to slightly Australianise this story today just to demonstrate how we think about behaviour support. So, there is a gentleman walking along the foreshore of a beach, let's say St Kilda if you're in Melbourne, and he's wearing a jacket. And the wind and the sun have a bet to see who can get the man's jacket off. The sun looks at the wind and says, you can go first. And the wind blows lots of cold air onto the man. And what does he do? He pulls his jacket tighter. Then the wind just blows more cold air, and all the man does is pull the jacket tighter and tighter and tighter as he walks along the beach. So the sun says, I've got this, move over, wind. And all the sun does is blow a bit of gentle warmth, shine a bit of gentle warmth onto the man, and guess what the man does? He takes the jacket off himself. When we are supporting people who live with dementia, unfortunately, due to no fault of our own, we are often the wind. We keep trying the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. Maybe trying the same thing we would have done before the person had dementia, such as logically arguing with them about something. But often all that does is cause more agitation, more hurt, more defensiveness. If we can be more like the sun, if we can think differently about situations, if we can think differently when we're trying to support people, then often we have more success. So if we are being the sun, what I want to do is give you, for the last 5 minutes before we go for questions, a series of 4 different strategies. And again, I'll just be looking at the tip of the iceberg with these things that you can consider if you're supporting someone who lives with dementia. Dementia-friendly communication is really important, and there's lots of different strategies we can use. I have generally found these to be the most effective. I'm also going to use language here, hopefully, that allows you to remember them. The first is talk like a newsreader. I don't know if you've watched the news much lately, but newsreaders don't talk like us. Newsreaders are trained when they speak to people to slow down and to leave longer pauses between what they say, because they're communicating with a wide audience of different language backgrounds, different thinking backgrounds. So a newsreader might talk like this. Today, Luke did a talk on dementia. You'll notice there that I'm leaving longer gaps between what I'm saying and I'm slowing down a little bit. When someone is showing a behaviour of concern, sometimes it's just easy to think, I need to talk like a newsreader right now. Don't expect people to remember. A really common trigger for people's agitation, particularly when they live with Alzheimer's disease, is when family and staff say to them, don't you remember? Don't you remember I said we were going out for lunch today? Don't you remember that I said I'd be back in 5 minutes? Don't you remember you haven't had a shower today? It is very unlikely that someone with Alzheimer's disease is going to say to you, oh, that's right. I have Alzheimer's disease, which causes a problem with memory. You're so right. Thank you for remembering. Now I remember I don't have a shower. It is more likely that it's going to tell you to get stuffed. Avoid the tourist effect. The tourist effect is this interesting thing that happens when someone doesn't appear to understand us. We just get louder and louder and louder. Why I call this a tourist effect is that many years ago when I was traveling in France, I was in a cafe and an American or Canadian speaking tourist said to the French speaking waitress, I want a coffee. The waitress didn't understand English. So all that person did, rather than trying to speak French, was get louder and louder and louder. Unless you know that the person that you support also has a hearing impairment, it might actually be due to more their thinking, their ability to process what you're saying, rather than how well they can hear you. And the louder you get, the more aggressive you seem. And therefore, often you might trigger their agitation, their irritability. We have to be really mindful of getting louder and louder and louder rather than maybe trying to say it differently. Try not to argue or rely on their insight. Again, this is this area of executive functioning. People might have trouble seeing your point of view, using the logic that you're using, or they may not have insight into what you're talking about. And the more you try to argue with them, the more you try to rely on their insight, again, it just causes more hurt for everybody. The importance of smiling comes back to this idea of social cognition. And that is, strangely enough, research tells us that the one emotion that someone living with dementia probably has more ease in identifying on your face is happiness. And the way that you can really smile is by thinking of something that makes you happy, because we generally then automatically smile, and that smile is a natural smile rather than a forced one. The other thing to consider is, can you say it differently rather than just saying it over and over again, going round in circles or getting louder? By the way, these strategies are not easy to implement. Hopefully I'm not putting pressure on you to say, yes, just go ahead and do this easily. A lot of these strategies rely on us to actually change our habits, changing the habits in the way we talk to people, the way we support them and interact with them. And changing habits for humans, we know, is very difficult to do and takes time. The next one is reassurance. Reassurance is a really powerful way of showing the person living with dementia that we are on the same page as they are. In this situation, you can rely on your social cognition. You can rely on the way that your brain reads other people's emotions. And if you think they're upset or angry, call it out. Reassurance can be verbal. Hey, I see you're having a really bad day today. I'm sorry about that. I understand you're feeling angry. I'm here to help. Rather than, why are you angry? What are you worried about? I don't understand. This reassurance approach often helps people calm down. Reassurance can also be physical. Touch can be very reassuring, but my only caution with this is you need to be very careful. Firstly, you have to know the person very well, and you also have to know that they don't mind being touched. And also you have to be able to read their emotion on the day, because whereas yesterday maybe someone enjoyed a hug, maybe that day when they're feeling agitated, they don't want a hug. And your attempts at physical reassurance and touch might actually trigger a behaviour for them. So verbal reassurance can be effective and is probably arguably safer. Physical reassurance can also be useful. You just need to be more confident with using that strategy. The next is called validation. I love this strategy. The reason why I love this is that in some ways, this is the opposite of trying to reason with someone, of trying to argue with someone, of going round and round in circles. Validation attempts to see the person from their condition, so separating the person and the condition. It is not someone, a sufferer of dementia, it is someone living with dementia. Knowing, for example, the things we spoke about today, how their condition may have affected their behaviour, their mental health, the way they think, the way they remember, allows us to separate what they're doing from the person and how the condition is affecting the person. It's a really important thing to consider. Try to see things from their reality. Can you find some middle ground? And you can be creative with your response. The example I often use in this area is baths and showering. As people with dementia, as their condition progresses, and I'm talking more now towards the moderate severe stages of dementia, often bathing becomes an issue and people can be really reluctant to have assistance and support with having a shower or having a bath or having a wash. So the question I often ask people, and maybe you can consider this in the audience today, is how often do you shower or have a bath? Is it every day? Is it twice a day? Is it not every day? For me, I shower Monday to Friday every day at least once. But on the weekends, sometimes I only have one shower. And the difference being is that Monday to Friday I go to work. But on the weekend, unless I've been to the gym, or I've been gardening, or I have a mate's wedding or something, sometimes I fall into bed on a Saturday night and I haven't even thought about a shower. But the purpose of this is not to shame you with your showering. It's to say there's a reason why you shower. If you can find that reason, if you can find the meaningful reason why someone with dementia would do something, particularly when you look back into their past about why they maybe had a shower or why they might do something, and then you introduce that as a reason, often that is much more effective than being overly logical, argumentative, using reasoning. Find the meaningful reason of why they might want to do something. So, for example, for me, I've already admitted to you, I am a Melbourne Demons fan. If I was living with a condition like Alzheimer's disease and I was not wanting to have a shower or thought I'd had a shower when I actually haven't had one, if you said to me, Luke, I really love you, help you have a shower because at lunchtime, we're going to have the Melbourne Demons game on and I want to get you into your Melbourne Demons jumper and scarf and let's clean you up a bit to do that. I will be in the shower before you are. If you can find those meaningful reasons, what makes someone tick? Their hobbies, their jobs, their family, their holidays, their football teams, their sexuality, their spirituality, their religion. If you know these things, often you can help motivate someone. The last one is distraction. Once you've used some reassurance, once you've used some validation, you can then distract them if they seem to be stuck on a situation. Distract them with an activity or conversation, but it needs to be relevant and meaningful. Again, this might be something in their personal history. For example, for me, it might be football or fishing or my family or meditation, all things I love. And start and leave strategies is where you can start something for them, such as put on a movie, give them a book to read, and then leave them for a period of time. So I know that we need to have some time for questions, and I've probably gone 5 minutes over time. I apologize. But hopefully today's talk, the presentation that I provided today, gives you some food for thought. This glass skull, how does dementia affect people with their thinking, with their emotions, with their behaviour, with their social skills? We can't see those changes in their brain, but the more educated we are about these things, the more we can understand. Because behaviour change is so significant in how it affects people, how it affects the people around them, I've given you very much a bit of a crash course today on how we do behaviour support. And again, if this has piqued your interest, there are many other opportunities maybe where you can get a bit more education support with behaviour support. And I might finish the talk there. Thanks, everybody. If you want to know more about me, this is my website, smithneuropsychology.com. If you have any queries for me, you'll also notice on the website that there's some contact information where you can enter your details in. Thank you so much.
Oh, look, thanks very much, Luke. That's a wonderful overview. You've managed to capture a lot of information, in a beautiful way and in a very caring way. And I think that's very memorable. There's a couple of questions which we might try and look at briefly.
Sure.
One is around prevention and risk. And I guess that's any comments to the kind of normal sorts of things that we hear about prevention and risk that you might want to add? Yeah.
So look, there's lots of information now out there because they've done so many longitudinal studies looking at aging and risk of dementia. We know that we have, unfortunately, a dementia epidemic coming our way. By 2050 rolling around, we're going to have a lot of people in Australia and around the world living with dementia. I will leave people to go and look that up. Organisations, I'm not sure, for example, if Swinburne have this information, but I know that, for example, the Dementia Australia website has lots of information. But the one lifestyle factor that I want to really point out that is research tells us is the most important is actually exercise. More than diet, more than other things, we know that people who exercise both aerobically, so things like running and swimming and cycling, but also, interestingly, anaerobic, so things like weights work, Pilates, that sort of stuff. We know that the more people exercise or certain levels of exercise significantly reduces your risk of dementia for a number of different reasons. But one simple reason is that the more that we work our heart and our lungs, the better our brain health is, because this thing directly feeds that thing. So exercise is something you can find out more about. But if you are choosing to look at exercise to reduce your risk, my strong suggestion is get a bit more information and maybe even seek support from a health professional such as your GP, an exercise physiologist, a physiotherapist. That can be really useful to know what sort of exercise and level you can do.
Thanks, Luke. There's a comment about medication. Just really the question was around when it might be not so appropriate.
Yeah.
Maybe a quick comment about that.
So look, the first thing to say is, as I mentioned before, I'm not a medical doctor. So I always joke with people, if I ever give you drugs, it's because I'm a drug dealer and need to call the police. But what I would say is that whether it's a medical practitioner like your GP, or whether it's a specialist medical practitioner like a neurologist, a geriatrician, a psychiatrist, make sure that person has knowledge about dementia. It may surprise you to know that some medical specialists or just GPs don't have a lot of knowledge about dementia, and therefore they may be prescribing things with spirit and obviously with good intentions, but it's important that if you are looking at prescribing medication, the person prescribing it knows things like side effects, knows what it's being used for, knows whether it might mix with other medications and not be so good in those situations. For example, antipsychotics used to be used very regularly in the dementia field decades and decades ago. We know there are significant risks for antipsychotics for people living with dementia. They are used much more sparingly now. So I'm not going to give advice on medication, but to say, find someone who knows what they're talking about. That's the key.
Thanks, Luke. One of our audience pointed out that the term manipulative and attention seeking is within the tool, within the new tool, and so that's obviously something that we have to think and change.
Look, it's just my personal opinion on that, Mark. I don't mean to be outrageous at all, but I think we often misinterpret and label people's behaviour without understanding why it changes and what's causing it.
Mm-hmm. Just one very, very quick, maybe just a couple of words around what keeps you going, Luke, in this area. And we had a bit of a chat about this, and we know each other, and you talking about stories and the inspiration you get from the people you see. Do you want a very quick comment before I ask Sunil to sum up?
Yeah, sure. We talk about in life these major stresses, divorce, losing your job, financial pressures. I think we can put on that list living with dementia or supporting someone living with dementia. I am constantly blown away by how people cope, and it inspires me as a clinician to keep going. I think, and I'm not sure if this is your experience, Mark, it's also sometimes a pretty under-resourced, and using this term sparingly, not a sexy area, and yet it's an area with so much need. And I think, like you, and we've spoken this before, I often learn just as much from people living with dementia and their supporters than I do from a research article. So that's what keeps me going.
Good on you, Luke. Thanks for your compassion. Sunil, over to you to some last minute comments.
Yeah, Luke, I agree with Mark. You've been able to present a lot of information in a way that, Mark's right. It's been very compassionate. And I think you're also very aware that we have people listening and viewing this webinar who are kind of living through pretty difficult times currently, and maybe having a family member or a friend or themselves going through the process.
Yeah.
I attended a conference by Dementia Australia one year, and I was surprised that I too had stereotypes about what dementia looks like. And I think the more people you meet with this condition, the more able you are to step away from those negative, hardened stereotypes and realize what you've said.
And Sunil, those stereotypes are normal, by the way. This is not something that's wrong with people if they see these stereotypes. Again, we are visual animals and people don't have glass skulls. So often we're guessing. So it's great if you have that experience. And hopefully today, this talk for some people may have broken down some of those stereotypes a bit more.
Yeah. I know in the education of health professionals, we're taught to use language really carefully. And I think you've been able to really highlight that. I mean, for example, you still hear people talking about people who are demented. And whenever I hear that, I think, maybe there's something kind of assumed there that the entire person has been consumed by the illness.
Yeah. And I think this change has happened also, Sunil, because the person living with dementia is now becoming the customer. They're saying, I don't want you to call me that I'm demented. I am someone living with a condition in the same way that other people do. And it's really important we're aware of that language, not so much about political correctness. It's more about respecting the person living with the condition. It's really important that we put them in the picture all the time at the center of that focus.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Luke. I really appreciate you sharing your evening with us and with the audience. We've got some very positive compliments coming through. In fact, one person would love to have lots more resources. And I think what you said earlier might point them in the right direction. Maybe Dementia Australia is a great one-stop shop.
There is, and look, I don't work for any one particular organisation in the dementia field, but what I would say is there's lots of great organisations. For example, Dementia Support Australia is also a great organisation. My only caveat is Google is not a good doctor. Dr. Google is not well qualified. So if you're looking for a professional or an organisation, just make sure they have the credentials and experience that you need for the situation you're in.
Great, thank you. So thanks again, Luke, and to the audience, thank you for joining us again. We hope to see you again at one of these webinars. And on that note, we'll be signing off, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, guys.